The startling revelation of the new painting has been provided by an X-ray, this is just a detail of it, which reveals a pentimento for the infant Christ's hand as it reaches across the Madonna's body to fiddle with the pages of the book. And this, I imagine you can see it here, there, oops. And it seems at first sight to be the right arm of the Christ child extended in a different position. But I think it's not possible with the child in the pose that it's in to reach that far forward credibly without altering its pose. And since all the other details of the child stretching across to the book show him doing this with his left hand, I think it has to be the left forearm that we are seeing just here. And this is a comparison between the X-ray and the Madonna di San Simone, or detail from the Madonna di San Simone, with the left forearm of the child reaching into the book in a very similar way. And just to ram home the point, this is the drawing in the Louvre, which is an early study for the Madonna di San Simone, where again the left hand of the child is extended to dive into the opening of the book. Inspection of the paint surface of the new painting reveals slight inconsistencies of color and irregularities of texture, where Barocci had painted over his earlier thought with the crimson red of the Madonna's bodice. And there, across there. It is interesting that Barocci decided to suppress the distinctive motif of the child extending his hand towards his mother's book, which is one of the hallmarks of the Madonna di San Simone. Indeed, the pose does not crop up again in his work. Nevertheless, it shows how the earliest version of the Madonna reading, which I believe to be the new painting, was even more closely locked into the central group of the altarpiece. The absence of the side crib from the lower right corner of the new painting reinforces the conclusion that it predates the other two versions of the composition, namely the drawing on exhibition here and the small Pallavicini painting derived from it. The insertion of this glimpse of the cradle seems to have been prompted by what Barocci must have regarded as a deficiency in the design of his first painted version of the composition. The whole bottom edge, in this first painted composition, the whole bottom edge is occupied solely by drapery. The Madonna's crimson dress covering her knees, and the end of the Madonna's white apron, over which falls a narrow band of her blue shawl. One can see why the painter might have thought that the base of the composition could be put to better purpose than this swathe of tricolore. This explains the appearance in the lower right of the drawing of the faintly drawn corner of a crib, with above it equally faint diagonal lines in red chalk to represent bedding. It was at that point only an initial idea, not yet fully developed. Here you can see the bedding, and I'll come into this is quite a major pentimento for the blue shawl, which comes over the apron, which was originally drawn coming right up against the side of the crib. In the Pallavicini painting, the corner of the cradle is described in more detail, and an orangey gold coverlet is clearly seen piled up within it. It is worth noting that if the drawing were in fact a ricordo of the painting, there is no reason why this detail should not have been more faithfully replicated. To include a glimpse of the cradle from which the Christ child has just been lifted by his mother seems a perfectly logical ploy by the painter to define the foreground space of his composition more clearly. It is also in keeping with his constant search for the harmonious interaction of all components in a composition, both figures and objects. To animate that corner of the Pallavicini painting, Barocci brought stronger definition than is seen in the drawing to the Madonna's blue shawl as it billows out from her left forearm, thereby setting off the gold coverlet. It is interesting to look at the ways in which the medium of drawing allowed a painter a freedom to experiment with different solutions on paper. For instance, in this comparison, we see that he reduced the amount of the Madonna's white veil showing over her plaited hairdo and just beneath her halo. However beautifully painted this passage might be in the new version of the composition, especially in the wonderfully improvised touches of ochre in her plaited reddish blonde hair and in the magnificent brushwork of her veil, Barocci perhaps came to see this over-generous headgear as a defect that grated with his self-critical nature. His decision to reduce the height of this covering in the drawing is perfectly understandable, since the Madonna already has a high forehead, so that by diminishing the thickness of the veil, the subject would become more pleasing. Another subtle change is the way the child's left foot is viewed. In the drawing, the curve of the ball of the child's left foot is intact, uninterrupted by any folds in the white apron on what he sits. In the new painting, however, and in the Pallavicini picture, a corner, you can see it here, a pleat, has been painted over the ball of the foot. So here you are, you have the ball of the foot intact. Here you have it just behind the corner of the drapery, thereby pushing back the foot into space, and in the drawing allowing the foot, as it were, to float upwards freely. If we look again at the same details of the Christ child's feet, an illuminating impression emerges of the way an artist's handling of conventional graphic media favorably compares to his work with the point of the brush. In the drawing, I have always been taken by the outlines in red chalk. Just go back here. I've always liked that bit here in particular. And you see an equivalent handling in sort of reddish brown, both in this foot and also over there. I think the equivalence between the two is quite remarkable. And another bit that I rather like, which I like very much, is the way the left leg comes out of dark and into the light. You don't see it quite here, but this is very thinly drawn, and then you get rather more grey, sort of greyish white, and rather more thickly applied media, and then of course you get the very thick white heightening along the lower shin, the ankle and the foot. And that is very much what you see here in the painting, the build-up of the materials as the forms fall under the light. Oh, there we are. I'm getting ahead of myself. Well, if you just apply my comments to these two images. Yes. And this too, I think, shows very well how, and it's much easier to see in these blow-ups than in the drawing itself, how certain passages gave the artist trouble. And unless you understand that he was sort of obsessed by this business of how one object should, or how one shape should approach another, you don't realize why there are so many attempts to get the corner of the book looking right against the knee of the child, or the bent little finger here against the big toe of the same foot. It's almost unbalanced in its search for perfection, but there it is. And I think also you see very well what I've tried to say earlier, that there is this extraordinary equivalence between the drawing here, where you get a fuzzy upper edge, and the uncertainty about that particular bit of the hand, of the finger, is still there in the painting.